This is the readings overview for week 6 of Game is Art. So let's get started. Take a look at your syllabus as always and the information on Blackboard. You'll find 4 readings for this week and also some playings, watchings as well. There's also a supplemental reading, so take a look at that. The supplemental reading is an article online by Hocking, who came up with a term that we're titling this week's discussion ludonarrative dissonance. Last week we talked about ludologist and narratologist and how those two groups of people have different ideas about how game and narrative fit together. The narratologists believe in general that games can be discussed in the same terms and with the same ideas and according to the same form that narratives can be discussed. Ludologist believes that's not true, that games and narratives are two different things and they deserve different sets of terms, concepts, and if either one is art, they deserve a different argument as to why each of those two objects are art. This week we're going to talk a little bit more about the ludology side. Last week we talked primarily about the narratologist side and mentioned prominently Marie-Laure Ryan. So this week the other side. Now I want to start out with the Jesper Juul article here, and that's up here. Jesper Juul we've seen before. We looked at his work when we were talking about defining games. You remember he came up with a way of defining games according to essential elements, and games according to Juul would have pure games would have all of his essential elements, whereas in between objects, things like driving in traffic maybe or playing Dungeons and Dragons, have some of the characteristics of a pure game, but not all of them. So we've seen him before, and Jesper Juul falls into the ludology camp. This is an interesting article in that he addresses some arguments of the narratologist and rebuts them. So what I want to talk about, not all of them in this brief overview, but at least this first one, the idea that we use narratives for everything. So one of the narratologist positions is that, well, games are narratives because essentially everything is a narrative. Everything can be reconstructed and recontold in a narrative framework, so it has at least the potential to be a narrative. Remember, Marie-Laure Ryan's version of that was that games aren't necessarily stories, but they're machines for generating stories. So that's an argument that Jesper Juul addresses here, and I'm going to let you read that argument of Jesper Juul's yourself, see what you think. I'm going to present maybe 2 alternatives to his argument, which agree with him, but are a little different than his today. And one of them is this article here by a philosopher, which I've got up here, Galen Strawson. Now, Strawson, this is a really interesting article. I highly recommend it. And let me summarize it for you briefly. He says that narratives are not a way of looking at the world that everyone has, that some people perhaps have experienced life as a narrative and think of things as narratives, including perhaps games, and others do not. So it's misleading and erroneous to say that games are narratives because, quote, everything is a narrative, because that's only true for some people. So he divides human beings really and ways of thinking up into 2 parts. One he calls a narrative sort of person, and the other he calls a non-narrative sort of person. You might want to read through this article and see which of those 2 categories, actually got 4 categories, but we'll simplify for the moment, see which of those categories you might fall into. But that's one way of addressing this argument, this broad argument of the narratologist that says, well, games are narratives because everything is a narrative. Is that true for everyone? Galen Strawson says no. Now there are certainly, there's some relationship surely between games and narratives. That is, we have a mixture of stories in games, which everyone is familiar with, and all sorts of different games, Grand Theft Auto and Skyrim and virtually any game you can name, except maybe Tetris and some other games, abstract games. But many games have some sort of story component or story aspect to it. Jesper Juhl acknowledges that, but says there are some differences between, nevertheless, there are still some differences between those two objects, games and narratives. One of them, he emphasizes, is the problem of translation. This is an interesting argument. Here's how it goes. He says, well, if you take the Star Wars game, if you take the Star Wars movies, you can, from those movies, from that story, using those characters, develop a game. And the game will reflect some component of the original Star Wars movies. But if you take the Star Wars games, there's no way you can go from the games back to the movies. And he contrasts that with the situation involving, say, novels and movies. When you translate a novel to a movie, it's essentially the same story. You know essentially what the novel is about, and vice versa. When you translate a movie to a novel, you know essentially what the movie is about. When you translate a game into a story, you very seldom, if ever, know how the game feels, what the game is about. Is it a first-person shooter? Is it is it a puzzle game? You don't know that. So that he calls the problem of translation, and that's the second of his three arguments. And since I've talked about two, let me mention the third as well. Games do share some traits with narratives, but the relationship between the reader, viewer, and the story world is different than the relation between the player and the game world. And this is what I want to focus on primarily in this video. So keep that idea in mind, and let's look at the David Bordwell article. And remember, we're focusing in on now, from a ludologist point of view, on the relationship between the game and the game player versus the relationship between the reader and the narrative. Now, David Bordwell we've seen before, just like we've seen Jesper Juhl before. David Bordwell, you remember, told us a little something about film art, classified the art film as a sort of genre within conventional films. And in this article, he contrasts games and storytelling and talks about the relationship between stories and the people who are being told the stories, and games and people who are playing games. Here's his argument. Storytelling is crucially all about control. Now, who has the control in the story? The reader doesn't, the author does. Whereas in media, particularly interactive media like games, it's the player who has control. Now, we called that, I think in the last video, let's call it again, player agency. So there's a conflict between player agency in games and author authorial intent and authorial agency in a narrative. That, by the way, is the theme of a game you're asked to comment on in the discussion post for this week, the Stanley Parable. So when you play the Stanley Parable, think about who's in control of that play. Are you in control, or is the author, we can call the author in this case the narrator, is the narrator in control? Now let me, as I said, I'm going to focus primarily this week on that relationship between the game player and the game. And to do that, I want to devote most of my time today talking about my chapter, my article for reading for this week, which is chapter 4 in my book, Games Are Not, because Games Are Not Narratives. Now, this is pretty clear, I suppose, an argument from a ludologist point of view. States it, right? Games are not narratives. And what I've done in this article is highlight some passages, as I go through it, I want to hit on them and develop this argument from my point of view as to why games and narratives have this issue, this conflict between player agency and author agency. Now, as I go through here, a bit of a review. Last week and the week before, we've talked about Bernard Suit's definition of games, David Bordwell's definition of narratives. You'll find that reviewed here again. I've used some different terms here to describe those two different perspectives, Bernard Suit's and David Herman. I call David Herman's definition one dealing with narrativity, whereas Bernard Suit's definition dealing with liminality. Now, a liminal space is similar to the notion of illusory attitude that we mentioned before. It's an in-between space. It's a space where neither the author or perhaps the player has full control, but it's different, at least to the argument we're going to develop now, to this notion or concept of narrativity. There's the David Herman criteria. I hope you're familiar with those by now. A little discussion again, review of Bernard Suit's. And in this passage, I'm emphasizing again that this distinction between Herman and Suit's is a formal or aesthetic distinction. This is going to be important as we're getting toward the end of the class now, particularly in week 8. I'm going to ask you to comment on the difference between conventional or institutional definitions of art versus formal or aesthetic definitions of art. Just keep in mind we're dealing with formal aesthetic definitions of narratives and games now. Now, as Jesper Juhl mentioned, certainly games and narratives aren't wholly incompatible. Clearly, there's some ability to combine the two. But the question is, to what extent is that combination satisfying? Are there aspects of storytelling and narratives that conflict with aspects of games and gameplay? That's the issue. So no one is arguing, Jesper Juhl is not arguing, and I'm not arguing that games and narratives are totally incompatible, that you can't put them together. Surely you can. What I'm arguing, and I think what Jesper Juhl and other ludologists are arguing as well, is there's some aspect of games and some aspect of narratives that are special. And if you put them together, you may diminish and perhaps extinguish what's special about the other form. So that's what we're setting up here as I thumb through. Marie-Laure Ryan, we talked about her last week. I mentioned her again. You might want to review your ideas and compare them and contrast them with mine here in this chapter. And eventually, we're still reviewing. Ryan talked about the difference between mimetic narrative and diegetic narrative. I hope you're familiar with those terms now. A diegetic narrative is one that uses representational forms to represent something other than the symbols and the words on the page, whereas a mimetic narrative is one that acts out. You pretend or you role play part of the story, and Ryan's argument, as you recall, was that mimetic narratives are analogous to games and gameplay. Alright, new stuff now. In this chapter, I introduced the concept of metalepsis. That's a term from narratology. It's a term used to describe narratives that somehow break the normal format, you might say in theater, the third wall or fourth wall of the theater. So when the narrator of a story directly interacts with the reader, that's an example of metalepsis. Some authors do this more than others, but this metalepsis idea happens in games too, where you're taken out of the story. Now, it doesn't happen necessarily when the narrator addresses you in a game. Not all games have narrators. But it happens when the story breaks down somehow in the game and you're thrown out of the story. The most common example of that is probably when you die in a game and you have to restart the game, or there's a glitch in the game, or the game won't load on your computer, or there's a lightning storm and power goes out. All of those things throw you out of immersion in the narrative and force you to somehow deal with a menu, or reboot your computer, or re-roll your stats. So there are a lot of these kinds of things that occur in games, similar to this idea of metalepsis in narrative. But Espen Aarseth, who's another ludologist, another game theorist, he's a professor at the University of Copenhagen, called this in fact dyslepsis, not merely transgressive of narrative, but destructive of narrative. So think about that when you're playing the Stanley Parable and you're being thrown out of the story from time to time by various means. What does that do to the story? Does it extend the story, or does it destroy the story? That's the idea to think about here. And that's a key, I think, to understanding the difference and the importance of the difference of the relationship between games and game players and narratives and people being told that narrative. Metalepsis in stories and transgression in stories somehow disrupts the story. Metalepsis in games allows us to reconsider the story, to rethink and renew our relationship to the story, maybe even put us beyond the story or above the story. Now, there are a number of sort of examples of this, and of course I want you to be commenting on the specific example I've given you to play, which is the Stanley Parable. But you might want to look at this section in my chapter, section 412. It begins on page 60 of the PDF file, and see how I deal here with Mass Effect 2. Some of you may be familiar with that game. And the sort of analysis I'm doing here is the sort of analysis I'd like for you to attempt, or at least think about when you play and write about the Stanley Parable. All right, getting to the end here and some sort of conclusion. Think about this. Well, here's the conclusion, and then I'll give you an argument or some evidence as to why I think this might be the case. Games and narratives exist most appealingly as aesthetic experiences within two different modes of human cognition. It may well be that when we're inside a narrative, we can't be playing a game, or it destroys our experience. It ruins our experience in the story. Likewise, when we're playing a game, it might be the case that if we're told a story while we're in the game, it ruins something unique about the game playing experience. That's sort of the argument that Jesper Juhl makes. It's sort of the argument that Galen Strawson is making. At least there are parallels, and those two arguments are in parallel, as well as Bordel's ideas. All three of those are in parallel with the argument I'm making here in this chapter, that there's something unique about the human experience of gameplay versus the human experience of reading or listening to stories. It's not that either are bad. It's not that emphasizing or insisting on preserving one destroys or diminishes the other. It's just, it seems as though they're different. Now, here's some evidence. How long have we been trying, have game designers been trying to create I call it the Holy Grail at the beginning of this chapter, some sort of synthesis of game and stories. The Colossal Cave game you played last week was an initial attempt, an early attempt, maybe a primitive attempt to do this, just that, to take storytelling elements, the joy, the form of narratives, and somehow put it into, surgically insert it into a game of some sort. That's been going on for some time. How successful has it been? When a new medium film came out, the narrative techniques that we were familiar with from text were very quickly adapted to film, and now we recognize film as a medium for conveying the same sort of depth and aesthetic value in narrative form that we associate with text. Is that true with games? Here I've got some examples of games that have sort of tried to take up this mantle of being the great combination of games and stories. Heavy Rain, you may remember that. The Witcher series, I know some people find that very appealing. Is it as appealing as a well-written novel? Or does it have a different, not a lesser, maybe not a greater either, but simply a different sort of appeal that we need to acknowledge, one that's not based at its core in a narrative form? Alright, that's my overview of the readings for this week. Once again, not great detail. Hopefully you'll read these things and be able to point out more in your discussion post that I've gone all over in this video. The Stanley Parable is a great game, I think, to play. So take a look at that, and that's it for this week. I'll see you next week.